Hello and welcome to episode 3, which is on subgenres of fantasy and science fiction. If you remember episode 2, I talked about how there had been a shift in fantasy and science fiction around the use of the hero's journey and the classic style of hero. That kind of shift in society and in the literature of society, of course, sees new subgenres emerging. And that's what I'm going to briefly go through with regard to fantasy and then move on to sci-fi very quickly for you. Okay, so we start with the subgenre of fantasy known as high fantasy. And when we talk about high fantasy, we often think of Tolkien. Tolkien was writing out of a classic tradition that saw him publish The Hobbit, Second World Fantasy, in 1937. Now, in the year before that, 1936, he'd done an Oxford lecture on Beowulf, subtitled The Monsters and the Critics, whereby he talked about the value of Beowulf as a poem in literary terms, but as a transition poem. Because it was largely an Anglo-Saxon, it had been dismissed by a lot of critics who preferred Latin-based civilization literature, and it was Tolkien himself who popularized Beowulf, and it's now hugely famous. But before Tolkien, it wasn't. It's in Beowulf that we first meet the dragon, of course. Beowulf is a poem about pagan or kind of a Norse society moving towards a Christian society, and the dragon, of course, is in the Book of Revelation of the Bible, first of all. And of course, that tradition is then used by Tolkien in The Hobbit with the dragon Smaug. Okay. I mentioned the Bible. High fantasy has a religious grounding. Tolkien himself was an ardent Roman Catholic. There is very little humor in certainly Lord of the Rings anyway. And not so much in The Hobbit either. It takes itself very seriously because it's about the soul of humankind. It's about fellowship and coming together and understanding the different races and tribes of the world. This is, of course, Tolkien having witnessed World War One. He started writing the mythology of Lord of the Rings while he was still in the trenches fighting in France in 1914 to 16. He was very traumatized by that episode, and the themes of war, of course, are central to The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. You know, many people talk about it as Second World Fantasy, but it is a response to the real world, and Tolkien talks about that in his letters as well. Okay, after high fantasy, we kind of had in the 50s and 60s with the Lord of the Rings coming out in 1954 after Second World War. In the 50s and 60s, we had a lot of YA fantasy, child-related fantasy. We had The Dark is Rising series, of course, famously. We had C.S. Lewis's Narnia series. We had Alan Garner's Weirdstone and Brisingamen. It's very nature-based, quite hippie-style fantasy. We get something of a backlash in the 70s. Michael Moorcock, the British fantasy writer, writes an essay called Epic Pooh, which slags off Tolkien no end as being nursery tales and stuff like that. And Moorcock writes grittier fantasy, and then Stephen Donaldson in America writes the Thomas Covenant 9-book series. Later becomes more than that, and he labels that epic fantasy. He writes an essay about the nature of epic fantasy as being more grounded in the real politic of the world, and he's got that essay. His sequence of books looks at big social models and political considerations, and he kind of creates epic fantasy, this subgenre that begins to dominate through the 70s and then the 80s and then even the 90s. What typifies it? Well, there is a lot more social negotiation, and as a consequence, a lot more humor than in the high fantasy of Tolkien. It's about how characters try and negotiate different political models of the world. There's always an evil empire, and remember the Cold War. You know, the evil empire is very much the Soviet Union, and it's America fighting this other politics and this and so forth. Um, Epic fantasy dominates until the end of the Cold War, basically, and of course we go into a new era of war. We have the Iraq conflicts, we have 9/11, we have Y2K, the Millennium Bug, and there is this sense that after the celebration of winning the Cold War, everything gets broken by this white heteronormative imperialist capitalist politics that has kind of tried to dominate the Middle East and kind of silence the other. And there's a backlash. And come the millennium, we get this proliferation of small subgenres, including urban fantasy set in the city. We get dark fantasy, which is with vampires and zombies, and the kind of the marginalized monsters, if you like, are becoming heroic now and replacing the traditional chosen one of the 80s and before that, of course. And we have my own metaphysical fantasy, which I coined back in 2008 and saw a succession of writers writing in that vogue. And we even, of course, had the biting satire of Terry Pratchett's comedic fantasy. And that all clustered around the new millennium. After that, the dominant subgenre became something called grimdark fantasy. Now, this is the austerity era subgenre, where we began to realize that the people at the top of society were corrupt. So the bankers had caused the financial collapse, and we had to bail them out. So how's that fair? How are they still getting away with it? We began to realize there was the expenses scandal of our MPs, people at the top of the society stealing money from the masses. We had the police selling information to the newspapers. That was another scandal. We had the newspapers hacking the phones of victims. This idea of the 80s and 90s with the noble kings and queens at the top of society, we kind of threw that out completely. Grimdark fantasy, we begin to see the people at the top of society, like in a Game of Thrones, as being the most immoral, the most corrupt people, and if anything, the enemy of the people. Grimdark is a matter of taste, of course. It is very depressing. A lot of your heroes end up dead, and the baddies often win out. In science fiction, of course, you had dystopian YA, very similar set of themes. And that's kind of where that brings us to where we kind of are now. We're not sure where we're going. We have N.K. Jemisin's genre-busting Broken Earth trilogy, which has won all the awards. It's very woke fantasy and science fiction. It refuses all labels, actually. It flips the hero's journey. It kind of gives us hope that there is a new way forwards. If you want more detail about subgenres, you might want to pick up The Subgenres of British Fantasy Literature by A J Dalton. Oh, that's me. Or if you want more on science fiction subgenres, The Satanic in Science Fiction and Fantasy gives you all you need. Or you can check my mini lessons in creative writing on my website. What's your website, Adam? Oh, it's www.ajdalton.eu. See you.